Thank you, Eddie, and thank you, Judge Cortez, for hosting today. And thank you all for coming. I know that people have very busy schedules, so it's always nice to see people show up. This is a very, very exciting time, I have to say. There are enormous changes going on globally. There are enormous changes going on within our region of North America. And there are enormous changes happening right here in our communities on the US-Mexico border. I want to try to bring the geopolitical situation down to the local level today. Talk a little bit about what's happening between the United States and China, how that impacts upon North America and specifically upon Mexico, the nearshoring phenomenon that we're seeing underway there, the successes, the challenges that still remain, and what I think some of the ideas are that we should be implementing here in places like McAllen to try to take full advantage of that phenomenon, which is just, honestly, it is the opportunity perhaps of a lifetime. So last night we had dinner with some friends, and somebody said, we like to think that NAFTA was the preseason. Now this is the real thing, because the nearshoring moment that we're experiencing is going to be a tsunami of investment that is coming in a much quicker time than what we've seen from NAFTA. So let me begin with the geopolitical moment that we're experiencing. Of course, as you all know, it's a period of intense rivalry between the United States and China. We're seeing shifting geopolitical patterns in Asia, in Europe, and of course, within the Americas itself, shifting allegiances and alliances with countries throughout the hemisphere. The geopolitical threats that we thought had been put to rest in the 1990s are clearly back. Even the threat of nuclear war. And for those of you who haven't seen Oppenheimer, it's a great reminder of what's really at stake. By the way, the book on which the movie is based was written at the Wilson Center. So there we go, a little plug for my institution. Those geopolitical threats, of course, were brought home most clearly by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent economic challenges to do with energy security, supply chains, and of course the military confrontation that is underway. Those supply chain challenges, of course, that wasn't the first time that we've had to confront those in recent memory because of COVID. COVID, the first time that most of us have actually been to the store and seen empty shelves or couldn't get the specific item that we wanted. I remember growing up in the UK in the 1970s. My mother, so I was a young boy, I was, I guess, 7 or 8 years old. My mother sent me up to the store to buy extra bags of sugar because there were going to be sugar shortages because Britain was a mess in the 1970s. So I do remember this happening before, but, in the extraordinary abundance that we've become accustomed to, this is the first time that most people have said, oh, I couldn't get toilet paper today. I couldn't get Coke, so I had to buy Pepsi or vice versa. And it brought it home to us that it's not just an automatic thing. That behind the store shelves, behind the jobs, behind all of the economic machinery of our country actually is a whole process that depends upon a lot of factors, that it's a highly complex thing. Now you pull all this together and you begin to see the challenge of a more turbulent, complex world. And whilst all that's going on, the United States, now through 2 administrations, from the Trump to the Biden administration, has proposed essentially a decoupling of the Chinese and American economies. The Chinese and American economies that have become so deeply integrated since the 1990s, in particular since China entered the WTO, which has resulted in enormous economic dislocation, but also the creation of enormous prosperity in China, and has helped to keep prices for consumers lower here in the United States and around the world. What's happened in China is nothing short of a miracle. That you have seen 800 million people being dragged out of poverty in a very short period of time. I mean, that's an incredible achievement. Whether you agree with the system or you think it's an evil system, it doesn't matter. That is what has been achieved by that process. And that has happened because, not just because of the Chinese government investing, but because of foreign investment there. And a lot of that investment has been American, of course. And we've now made the decision through the Trump and Biden administrations to pull back. And the Biden administration has become particularly aggressive about that by putting forward what is now becoming known as the Biden Doctrine, recently enunciated at the Brookings Institution by Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, which essentially is saying we can no longer just make things where it's cheapest. We can no longer just rely upon global supply chains based upon the lowest price is the law motto, that we now actually need to think about where we make the goods that we buy, who are our economic partners. We need to be much smarter about geoeconomics, because geoeconomics impacts upon geopolitics. And all of that ultimately brings us back to the question of reshoring here to the United States, a process which is firmly underway, and we're seeing a lot of money coming back home to the United States to invest in manufacturing. Of course, in ally shoring, in countries which are friends and partners of the United States around the world. Perhaps the best example of that right now is Australia, which is becoming such an important source of the critical minerals that the United States needs for the energy transition, for the EV, electric vehicle revolution. And Australia, I mean, honestly, in the time that I've been tracking international affairs, Australia has never been more important to the US economy than it is today, and has never had a higher presence in Washington than it does today. We've got reshoring, we've got ally shoring, and then of course there's nearshoring. And nearshoring means bringing production back home so that when there are supply chain disruptions, we don't have to depend upon container ships crossing the Pacific. It helps us in terms of just-in-time production. It helps us in terms of security of supply and logistics. And of course, that brings us to Mexico. Because the new Mexican moment that we're experiencing today is really based upon nearshoring and the extraordinary competitiveness that Mexico has built up since the signing of the NAFTA back in the early 1990s, the coming into force in 1994, and of course the renegotiation of NAFTA and the signing of the USMCA just a few years ago in 2020. And just a quick note on that. The USMCA is one of those things that we kind of take for granted now. Number one, it was an incredible achievement that anybody could renegotiate the NAFTA, which had become a four-letter word in Washington. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted it to be gone, but nobody wanted to talk about it. So we all said, well, listen, it's a 20th century trade agreement, but we'll just leave it be and we'll try to tinker around the edges. And Donald Trump, whether you love him or hate him, was probably the only politician that could have actually got progress on that by threatening to blow it all up. And speaking to his staff, folks who worked with him in the White House, actually somebody who rescued the letter from his desk in the Oval Office where he was about to sign saying, I withdraw the United States from NAFTA. You know, they actually took the letter off his desk on at least 2 occasions. He was truly determined to get a better deal. And ultimately, whether the USMCA is better than NAFTA or worse than NAFTA is a secondary question, because what it is, it's a 21st century free trade agreement. And the incredible thing about that is that it's the last free trade agreement that the United States is going to sign for a very, very long time. Because right now the mood in Washington is not in favor of free trade. So when we take a look at the USMCA and we kind of just assume that it's there, we should pause for a moment and say this is an incredible achievement. And not just because we got an update on the NAFTA, but because other countries are desperately trying to get exactly the same thing for themselves and they won't get it. That's what Mexico, the United States, and Canada have as a comparative advantage over other parts of the world. So when you look at the map of Mexico and you look at where investment is flowing right now, predominantly to the north of the country and to the Bajío region, right there in the center of Mexico, less so to the south of the country. But I'll come back to talk about the south of the country in a little while. When you look at the advantages of the north of the country, the border states, of course you have a well-educated, trained workforce, you have the geographic proximity, you have well built out infrastructure, and you actually have pretty reliable and dependable energy supply systems. When you go down into the center of the country, you have a very well-educated workforce. You have a well-educated workforce. You have good infrastructure. Of course, you don't have that geographic proximity, but increasingly, and in the time that I've been tracking Mexico the last 30 years, you've seen a build out of the business culture in that part of the world, which is really incredible. In particular, in the north of the country, of course, we need to talk about the state of Nuevo León, because Nuevo León is an incredible state in terms of its business culture, in terms of its approach to working between government and the public sector. And Nuevo León is really just, I would say right now, perhaps the most exciting state in Mexico to follow. And in particular, what's happening there with Governor Samuel Garcia, and of course the Tesla moment that they're experiencing. So Tesla committing $5 billion to building their EV production plant in Monterrey, generating probably a further $10 billion in investment around that. And that's just one example, the best example, but just one example of a flood of investment going in. So as you can see on the graphic, on the next graphic, nearshoring in Nuevo León is responsible now for 72% of the nearshoring investment coming into Mexico, just that one state. The proximity to the United States is one part of it. The workforce is another part of it. The business culture is another part of it. You've got a young governor who really wants to engage, not just with his local constituency, business community, etc., but he really has national ambitions, and he even reaches across the border. And so when you see the kind of work that Nuevo León has been putting into its border master plan, building out infrastructure for their one border crossing up in the port of Colombia, but not just thinking about how do we get goods across the border, how do we get goods to the border, linking up highways, working with universities to make sure that the workforce is there. This is a truly strategic vision for the state. And Nuevo León is very well equipped to take advantage of the nearshoring phenomenon, but it still faces challenges. Industrial parks are filling up very, very quickly, which means that real estate prices are going through the roof. Talent is being used up, so we're seeing tighter and tighter labor markets, and companies are increasingly saying, well, Nuevo León looks good on paper in terms of the skills, but when we get here, we actually can't find the skilled labor that we need because the other companies are already employing them. So we're getting that kind of competition between companies, which is great for wages, but not so great for competitiveness. You're seeing problems in terms of energy delivery, in particular green or renewable energy that the companies are increasingly looking for, but most importantly, reliable energy sources. One of the problems of the López Obrador administration in Mexico over the past 5 years is they have underinvested in the energy infrastructure, and they have underinvested in renewable energy, which means now that the state government of Nuevo León spends a lot of its time trying to secure renewable or clean energy sources for the industrial parks, which is what the investors actually want. And of course, infrastructure. Whilst they have this strategic master plan for building out the infrastructure up to the border and even over the border by working with Governor Abbott, despite the issues that exist between Mexico and Governor Abbott and Nuevo León and Governor Abbott, there's a cooperative sense there. Even though they're doing all of that, their infrastructure will rapidly become saturated. So what we need is actually not just a vision of what's coming now and in the next couple of years. We need a 10-year vision of how do we build this out. And of course, that extends across the border into Texas. And what we're seeing right now here in the Rio Grande Valley, of course, is an enormous amount of investment. Just to talk about, education, transportation, airports, highways, etc. All of that's very, very positive. We're seeing cities coming together in alliances, trying to work together to coordinate all of this. And of course, the very exciting prospect of LNG exports from Brownsville. And let me just take a moment there to talk about the possibility of exporting from the port of Brownsville. If you go back to the map that you have of Mexico, and if you look at how Mexico comes down from the sort of very wide down to the very narrow and then shoots off to the side, that narrowest part of Mexico where it says Coatzacoalcos, you see, and Salina Cruz. So down in the green part of the map, that's the narrowest part of Mexico. And in the times of Porfirio Diaz, they came up with an idea. They said, listen, what if we were to build either a canal across there linking the two oceans or some kind of transportation link? And people have talked about it over the last 100 years or so. The current López Obrador administration is actually doing it. They're building a rail link that connects those two ports, which connects the Gulf of Mexico with the Pacific. And their idea is to build out the transportation connection so that ships coming from Europe, for example, can unload in Coatzacoalcos, and then the containers can be reloaded onto ships in Salina Cruz, saving all that time of going down to the Panama Canal, offering a much cheaper option. It's a brilliant idea, but not just that. They're hoping to build out manufacturing around that corridor, the transoceanic corridor that is being built down in Mexico. If they do it right, and there's a lot of work still to do, but if they do it right, that could be a game changer for Mexico, and particularly for that part of Mexico, southern Mexico. But it's also a game changer now for East Coast ports in the United States, and in particular thinking of Brownsville and all of the goods that we could export through that port down to the transoceanic corridor and off to Asia. That could become Texas's exit to Asia, which is an extraordinary opportunity. And I'm happy to answer questions about that in the Q&A. So what are the challenges that we face on this side of the border? As I said, I think that we're doing a great job here in terms of investing in human capital, in terms of investing in infrastructure, transportation, etc., energy. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And if you look at the top states for business in America, the latest ranking for 2023, Texas does very, very well in terms of the ranking. It's ranked number 6 in the country. North Carolina first, Virginia second, Tennessee third, Georgia, Minnesota, Texas. Okay? And if you look at it, it does particularly well on workforce because, of course, you have a very strong workforce, a young demographic profile here. That's good. Doesn't do so well on infrastructure. 24th in the country on infrastructure. We need to invest a lot more. In terms of the economy, it's second. Very, very strong economy. We all know that about Texas. Cost of doing business, 16th, which is kind of a surprise. You would have thought that Texas would be doing better in terms of the cost of doing business. Tech and innovation, 8. Not always what people think about with regards to Texas, but Texas is a high-tech economy as well. But here's the one that stands out, and I think this is where it speaks to you, Judge Cortez, which is life, health, and inclusion. Texas is 50th in the United States. That 50th place or ranking highlights the need to invest in the kind of things that the Prosperity Task Force is doing. Yes, in education and workforce development. Yes, in terms of understanding the needs of families that live in poverty. How do we actually enable them to pull themselves up out of poverty and to get to the next level? Because that is the real challenge right now. We all know that there are enormous amounts of wealth being generated right now in northern Mexico and here on this side of the border. The question is, how do we take it to the next level to actually build out the opportunities for local populations, which essentially is building out the future of internal demand in our economies. It's making our economies bigger and making them fairer at the same time. You know, the kind of figures that Judge Cortez has mentioned on a number of occasions, the 29% poverty rate, which you estimate is a low number, should be higher. The problems with food insecurity, that's just one of the things that stands out. And you think, if you're worried about where your next meal is coming from, or if your kids aren't eating right, how do they learn properly? And you sort of telegraph that forward about how do they actually get a decent education out of this. These are the challenges that I think we're facing today. And funnily enough, I think it's some of the same challenges that we're seeing south of the border as well. And if we look forward to the 2024 presidential election in Mexico and the prospects for who will win, and I take you there to the last slide on the deck. On the right of the slide, you have President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, now in the final year of his administration. And everybody, myself included, up until 2 months ago, assumed that his party, the ruling Morena party, would easily win the presidential election. To the left of that slide, you'll see three figures: Marcelo Ebrard, Adán Augusto López, and Claudia Sheinbaum in the pink shirt. Those three are the contenders for the nomination for the Morena party. And it's been our assumption, everybody's assumption, that whoever won the nomination would end up being the president of Mexico. And then 2 months ago, or just under 2 months ago, the woman standing here with a piece of paper, Xochitl Gálvez, burst onto the scene. She had been a senator for the last 5 years and a constant critic of López Obrador, and she was being put forward as a potential candidate to be mayor of Mexico City in 2024, which would have meant that the center-right party, the PAN, would win Mexico City for the first time, and that would be a huge shock to the ruling party Morena, which had just assumed that they would always rule Mexico City. And then López Obrador, the president, at his morning press conference, his mañanera, decides one day to attack Xochitl Gálvez. And he makes certain accusations against her. And she then comes back and she says, I demand the right to reply. And so she shows up at the presidential palace one morning, knocks on the doors during the morning press conference, and they refuse to let her in, which catapults her into national fame. The president responds by attacking her even more, by showing at his morning press conference confidential tax documents from her company that he doesn't have any right to show. He has violated several laws by doing so, and attacking her further. And the hype around this woman is building and building and building. I was lucky enough to have lunch with her about 5 weeks ago in Mexico City, and she's the real deal. She's the real deal in terms of a candidate. And the reason why I'm telling you this story is because she is the example of what we need to achieve here in McAllen, in Mexico, across the border, etc. Xochitl Gálvez grew up in an indigenous family in the state of Oaxaca. Her father was an alcoholic and highly abusive. Her mother sold gelatinas in the traffic. Xochitl made the gelatinas for her mother. She lived a life of, she said her childhood was difficult, but there were moments of happiness. But she lived a very difficult life in poverty. She got herself a good education. She pulled herself up by her bootstraps. She made it. She set up a tech company. She made a lot of money. She went into politics, and now she's where she is. In the polls at the moment, she's 10 points behind the candidates from the ruling party, and the campaign hasn't even begun yet. Nobody thought that any other candidate would be able to get more than 30%. She has 34% of the popular vote at this point in time. I'm not saying she's going to win next year, but I'm saying that she has actually now made it really interesting. And here's the great thing about Xochitl Gálvez. She says, listen, I don't believe that everything that the current president has done is wrong. I disagree with his attitude towards investors. I disagree with his attitude toward business. I disagree with many of the things that he's done. But the one thing that he has done is she says he's put more money into the hands of the poor. And we need to think about that. We need to think about how do we actually help people raise themselves up out of poverty. Because we can't just have wealth accumulation. We need to think about questions of distribution as well. So if a minor miracle happens and she wins next year, We'll have a president in Mexico who is business friendly and wants to work with the poor. And that would be a great partner, I think, for McAllen, for the Prosperity Task Force. And I look forward to perhaps coming back, and perhaps we can set up a dialogue with our counterparts in Mexico at that point. Whoever wins in Mexico next year, I think we have a very interesting prospect, because López Obrador has not been friendly to investors, but despite that, money has flooded into the country because of nearshoring. But the $35 to $40 billion that have come into Mexico on an annual basis over the past 12 months is probably half of what they should be receiving. If they had more business-friendly policies, if they had an energy policy that was working, they would be able to attract a lot more business, a lot more money. And I suspect that whoever wins, either from the ruling party or Xochitl Gálvez, will be a lot more investor-friendly, which means that we could see Mexico moving to the next stage of economic development. And we always say this periodically, we say Mexico's on the verge of becoming a first world country, and it always falls back. But this time may actually be the real deal. This time may actually be where the nearshoring phenomenon, combined with our free trade agreement, combined with the right policies, combined with a much more friendly approach to investors and the bilateral relationship, means that we could jump ahead. I'll stop there, and hopefully we can have a time for discussion and Q&A. Thank you.